Well, in spite of all of the different rumors that we've heard over the last couple of weeks now, the Kraken ended up doing nothing at the trading deadline except getting another win. What's cracking, everybody, and welcome back to Kraken R&R, where the Seattle Kraken do make it a bit more interesting than we would have liked, again, against the Columbus Blue Jackets, one of the worst teams in the NHL. But once again, they come out with a victory, winning 4-2 in Columbus. Of course, though, as I mentioned there at the start, people were just as focused on what the Kraken were doing at the start of the day as they were on what they were going to do at the end, or in the evening Pacific time anyway, as the trade deadline for the NHL did come at noon, just 3 hours before the game started, or 4 hours, I guess, before the game started. The trade deadline, which last season they were very busy at, and normally I would do a separate video on what the Kraken did at the trade deadline, and honestly, I still thought about it. But in the end, because they did absolutely nothing, I'm just going to include it here before the game, especially considering this is a game where they kind of just took care of business, even if they did make it a little more interesting, as I said, than we might have liked. If you were one of the people that joined for the stream of this game, you will probably have already heard me say some of this. But basically, with this trade deadline for the Kraken, I certainly wasn't overwhelmed by the moves they made, and wasn't really that underwhelmed by it either. I guess I was just whelmed, if that makes sense. Either way, in the end, while it certainly wasn't the most interesting trade deadline from a Kraken fan standpoint, it might be one where making no move was the right move for the Kraken. Now, I know there's going to be people who are disappointed that the Kraken didn't make any moves and weren't buyers here at the trade deadline trying to add to this team that's making a playoff push and potentially make this roster better for hopefully a deep playoff run. But honestly, as I've mentioned in some of these R&Rs, heck, just the last one leading up to the deadline, the Kraken are in a spot where, yeah, this season has been much better than anybody expected, but because they've gotten to where they are with the depth that the team has, and one of the deeper teams, or has, the depth is a bit bigger part of this team than it is really any other team in the NHL, it does mean that they don't have as much to gain by adding pieces during the deadline. Which isn't to say that the Kraken couldn't have added to this roster at the deadline. I mean, a lot of the players that we saw go in these last couple of weeks, like the Ryan O'Reillys, Vladimir Tarasenko's, Patrick Kane's, all are players that would have easily fit into maybe even the top line for the Kraken. Heck, probably the top line for the Kraken. But with their depth being the way it is, it does mean that there's less of a big jump that they would make as far as talent on the team with those additions as some of the teams who were buyers at the deadline did. And as a result, they probably have less value or are willing to give up less to make those trades. On top of the fact that, unlike a lot of those teams who were buyers, most of whom were in the Eastern Conference, so the Western Conference really not big buyers as far as that's concerned, and that definitely, I think, would add to the lack of feeling of urgency from a Kraken perspective to be buyers. But a lot of those teams that were buying are teams that are trying to really win now and don't have those years to be waiting around to hope the team can get better in the future. Where, as we mentioned with the Kraken, although this year has been a pleasant surprise and we want to see how far they can take this, still their window seems like it's probably more a few years down the road, especially considering, as we mentioned a number of times, their best player, or one of their best players, is now 20 years old. So basically, if the Kraken were to have made moves, they may have had to overpay from their perspective in order to do so, and I just don't really think they're in a spot right now where that feels necessary. And speaking of reasons for the Kraken not to overpay during this deadline specifically, well, this draft coming up where the Kraken have still their first round and 3 second-round picks is looked at by scouts all across the league as one of the best, if not the best, and probably the deepest draft since the Eichel McDavid draft, well, getting close to 10 years ago. Of course, yes, the Kraken do have a full complement plus of draft picks for the 2 years following this year's draft, but there's a reason that pretty much everybody this year was trying, all the teams that were selling anyway, were trying to pick up draft picks from this year's draft primarily, and then if they had to add to that with picks from the next 2 drafts, then so be it. But there was a lot more value, not only because it was this year's draft, but also because of the talent in the draft. Teams were looking to pick up picks from this 2023 draft. So with all that being said, from a Kraken perspective, buying a rental player specifically, which most of the players that went at this deadline are kind of rental type players that are going to end up playing with that team for a couple of months, that playoff push and playoff run, and then leaving in free agency. So that kind of pickup didn't really make sense for the team, and there were a couple of players like Jakob Chychrun and Timo Meier that aren't going to fit that type of player, as they still have years left on their contracts. And honestly, I would have been okay with the Kraken making more that type of move had it been available for them. And I think they probably asked around about those and saw what the prices were and just decided it was too much for them. Which even there, outside of what the price could have been, there is also the issue that the Kraken are pretty close, within $1 million of the salary cap, and even with it hopefully going up this summer, they have a bit of a situation that they're going to have to figure out already, with Vince Dunn likely to get a big raise here, assuming they re-sign him, which probably already means that Carson Soucy is going to end up having to leave the team, as well as potentially Will Borgen, Daniel Sprong, and Ryan Donato. So if the Kraken were to have picked up especially a guy with a contract like Timo Meier, but even a guy like Jakob Chychrun, then they would have had even more of a puzzle to figure out in the offseason, as a lot of that money that they have up against the cap is still tied up for another couple of years, and really Soucy's the only one with more than $1 million that they will have coming off the books naturally at the end of this season. And speaking of which, especially considering that whole situation with Soucy in particular, that has him likely leaving the team in free agency in the offseason, I think the fact that the Kraken didn't make any moves to sell Soucy, for example, or even Will Borgen, which there were some rumors about, whether or not those were true, we still don't know. But the fact that the Kraken didn't trade players out that they probably won't be bringing back in the offseason and getting value for them while they can, even in itself is kind of like being a small buyer at the deadline. If nothing else, it's certainly a vote of confidence from the management, and Ron Francis in particular, in the roster as it is right now, and the guys in that locker room, that they got this team to where they're at, and he doesn't want to mess with that and potentially, disrupt that camaraderie and locker room chemistry that they have right now, especially with this being a team that, like we've said, has been successful off of its depth and having scoring from all throughout the lineup, which does, I think, bring that locker room even closer together, and even bringing other guys in, but especially taking guys out of that, could potentially mess with that, and I'm not sure that that is really incentive to go out of your way to make moves at a deadline. In fact, it probably serves the opposite. Anyway, all of that is to say that while the fact that there weren't any fireworks around the Kraken at this trade deadline did make it a little bit less interesting from a fan perspective, and it would have been fun to get a little bit more excitement and adrenaline shot into these last 20 games with a big ad like, Chychrun or Meier, who was already gone by the trade deadline, but if they had picked him up in the last couple of days before New Jersey got him, that would have been fun. But in the end, the Kraken doing nothing was probably the best for where they're at right now, as well as where they're trying to go in the next 5 to 10 years. And focusing back in a little bit on where they're trying to go this season, well, honestly, I think the big goal is just make the playoffs and then see what happens. Obviously, it would be great if they could make a cup run, but I don't think that's really expected, and even adding a Chychrun or Meier or any of the players that went, I don't think really necessarily would have changed that a ton. I mean, sure, if they bought as much as like a Toronto, for example, maybe you're looking at a deep cup run. But even still, it's not really where the Kraken are at. And really, at this point, all they have to do is continue to pick up wins in the games that they should be winning. Like this one in Columbus, where they do manage to win, even though for a third game in a row, they made it interesting until the final minutes. A game in which, for the Kraken, with the lack of additions or subtractions from the roster, they were able to come into it with pretty much the same lineup as what they had in the last game, or at least the end of last game, as Grubauer gets the start in net, and really the only change otherwise was Frodin back in place of Sprong, who actually got waived by the Kraken just hours earlier, since he had to technically be on the roster of the Firebirds if he wants to play with them in the playoffs. So the Kraken waived him just for paperwork reasons in order to have him technically a part of that roster at the deadline, but then brought him back to the Kraken in order to play in this game just hours later. And he had an alright game. He doesn't end up scoring, but nobody ended up scoring in the first period, where it was kind of just a nothing period. The Kraken really had trouble getting their legs under them. They certainly didn't get off to the fast start that we've seen them get off to in most of their games recently, at least the Boston, Toronto, and the last two wins. Actually, not the one in St. Louis, but the one in Detroit. Either way, it was not a particularly fast start for the Kraken, as they were at least playing better in the defensive zone. Something that we talked about them needing to improve going forward was really locking down that area in front of the net and getting back to playing that suffocating defense, keeping everything to the outside that we'd seen during their hot streaks of the season. They were able to get back to that, but it seemed like for whatever reason that came at the cost of being able to transition out of their end of the ice through the neutral zone and especially play well in the offensive end, where they were pretty sloppy and couldn't really get much of anything going. And that all remains true right up until, once again, like what happened in Detroit, a parade to the penalty box gets started, this time more towards the end of the first period than the start of the second, but it's the Blue going to get the first crack at it. The Kraken do kill that off, then Seattle gets a power play right at the end of the first period, which, since this period ends 0-0, once again the Kraken are able to score on. But the good news, at least if you've been watching the last few games, is that this power play is going to end with still a few seconds left in the first period for them to potentially score right after the power play comes to an end. Instead, though, with those last few seconds, they send Columbus to a second power play, which pretty much just has time for the face-off to get done with in the Kraken end before we go to the second, where fortunately the face-off comes back to center ice. So they at least get that little break, which may have helped them kill off this power play. And then right afterwards, it's the Kraken back to the power play themselves, as the teams are just trading places in that penalty box. And while the Kraken aren't able to score again on this power play, they are able to start to get some momentum, which they keep for a few minutes, don't score, and eventually it comes to an end with, of course, Columbus going back to the power play. The power play for the Blue Jackets, which this time, actually the Kraken end up killing off again, and it turns out to be the best kill that they have in the game. I don't think they even allowed a shot attempt, much less a shot on goal from the Blue Jackets. Maybe they allowed one right at the beginning, but it's a pretty harmless power play from Columbus, which is good news right up until seconds after it comes to an end. The Kraken are back in the box as they just can't stay out of it. They have trouble getting guys back out on the ice as they get to full strength, and they end up with a too many men call, which on replay reveals, sure enough, they had 7 guys out on the ice. So one goes to the box, and within 15 seconds of the fourth power play, even with the Blue Jackets, I mean, they've got Patrick Laine and Johnny Gaudreau, so while they don't have much beyond those two guys, if you continue to tempt them over and over again with power plays, which those two are a big part of, eventually one of them's going to score, and sure enough, it's Laine who, with a perfect shot into the top corner, beats Grubauer, who I wouldn't say he didn't have a chance on this one, but again, it's an absolutely perfect shot from Laine in a dangerous area on the power play that finds the top corner and gives Columbus the 1-0 lead. So at this point, if you're a Kraken fan, and this might just be the PTSD from that Sharks game a couple weeks ago talking, but you're feeling pretty frustrated at the fact that the Kraken are once again down scoreless, but behind and without a goal to one of the worst teams in the NHL. And while they have been playing better defensively than they did in that game against the Sharks, offensively, they just can't seem to get anything going. The silver lining to this goal that gives Columbus the lead, though, is that it does seem to finally wake up the Kraken as they make a very good push at the other end, getting shot after shot, holding the offensive end for 2 shifts. And while it doesn't end up coming up with a goal even strength, they do end up getting a power play eventually out of it. And mercifully, this time we don't even have to wait for the power play to come to an end for the Kraken to end up evening up the score. And of course, it's Jared McCann with the goal. Just about 30 seconds into the power play, the puck eventually finds its way to McCann, actually off of a very nice keep of the zone by Vince Dunn, as he backhand stretches out to keep this puck from exiting right on the blue line. He gets it down to Bjorkstrand. Bjorkstrand all the way across to McCann, and in one motion, McCann receives that pass and then flings off the wrist shot on net. And just like Laine before him, goes perfectly into the top corner short side to give the Kraken their first goal of the game, and him his 30th of the season. The first time not only he has reached 30 goals, but any Kraken player has reached that mark. And of course, tying up the game, a very important tying goal for the Kraken. And obviously, outside of McCann's 30th, it was also nice to see Bjorkstrand at least get a primary assist in his return to Columbus. And also, thankfully, with this now being both teams having scored on the power play in relatively short order, it does signal the end of the parade to the penalty box that both teams have been contributing to. It doesn't, however, signal the end of the Kraken and Jared McCann putting pucks in the back of Columbus's net. Now, the second goal that comes at 5-on-5 and not long after the Kraken tied the game up doesn't actually come off of the stick of McCann, but it does start there as Eberle gets a nice crossing pass in transition to McCann, who gets a partial break, fires off the shot, but that is saved by Merzlikins in net, who, although he's been one of the worst goaltenders in the NHL this season, having a pretty tough year even on a bad Columbus team, he was playing very well in net for them in this game. He makes that save on McCann, but it rebounds out to Eberle, who's able to come in following the play, pick up that rebound, makes one move to his backhand, and then slides it right through the 5-hole of Merzlikins, who committed to a original shot from Eberle. Eberle makes that one move instead, then slides it through the legs as Merzlikins tries to recover from overcommitting to the Eberle rebound shot. And the puck just slides right under his pad across that red line and into the net to give the Kraken the 2-1 lead. McCann his second point of the game anyway, if it's not his second goal. And Eberle with that goal picking up his 50th point of the season, which does tie McCann's record from last year for points in a season by a Kraken player. At this point, somewhat frustratingly, I think if you're a Kraken fan, play does kind of even out here as the Kraken aren't able to build more momentum after getting the lead, and nobody ends up scoring throughout the rest of the second period. It really would have been nice to see the Kraken continue to try to build on that lead, because as we get a few minutes into the third, although Seattle does start to kind of get things going, it's still relatively even play between the two teams. And eventually, with the Kraken just having that 1-goal lead, the problem with having just a 1-goal lead is it can disappear with a lucky bounce. And that's what Columbus gets a few minutes in as Laine has a shot from right up by the blue line straight down the middle that's deflected right in front of him by Geekie, but the deflection from Geekie gets past him and then just kind of dribbles or bounces right to another Columbus player. He says thank you very much and fires that puck off on net. Grubauer doesn't have time to react to the deflection from Geekie, and it gets past him to tie the game at 2. And then things get even more nerve-wracking as Columbus is actually the team that responds to this goal, building momentum and getting a couple of very dangerous chances shortly after this, which Grubauer is able to come up with a couple of very nice saves on. One pretty good save, and then an even better one on the rebound chance. But just after that, thankfully the Kraken are going to get a power play as Columbus ends up heading to the box out of their offensive end. And it's a power play for the Kraken that does not last very long. They do end up winning the faceoff. It goes from McCann winning that faceoff out to Dunn, who just kind of takes it along the blue line to the middle of it, passes it down to Tolvanen, who is defended so he doesn't have a chance for a one-timer, as they were very obviously trying to feed Tolvanen one-timers. And then the first goal on the power play ends up happening for McCann because they were feeding Tolvanen so much for those one-timers that eventually the entire Columbus penalty kill just shifted towards Tolvanen's side. Forgot about McCann. That pass got across to McCann, and he had the time to take that shot. And this time, once again, Tolvanen isn't able to get the shot off, but he does get it down to Wennberg, who, surprise, surprise, decides to press the net right next to it, go for the shot himself, and he just gets that puck standing next to the net, whips around 180, shoves it in towards the net backhand, and it goes right through the legs of Merzlikins and into the net just 15 seconds, or maybe even less than that, into this Kraken power play. They score on back-to-back power plays and now have the lead. It's 3-2. And of course, for Bjorkstrand, we talked about how it was nice to see him getting a primary assist on the power play. Unfortunately, at this point in the game, somewhere here in the third period, he did end up leaving the game and not coming back with an undisclosed, it looked like, lower body injury. So hopefully Bjorkstrand can get back quickly. It does sound like Burakovsky. That was actually the one piece of good news that we got from that interview with Ron Francis following the trade deadline, or at least indisputably good news anyway. No matter how you look at the trade deadline stuff, it was good to hear that Burakovsky is very close to coming back. But now Bjorkstrand, unfortunately, in his return to Columbus after getting that primary assist, did end up exiting here in the third period, and hopefully he isn't out too long. But he wasn't the only player returning to Columbus, as Wennberg, although he returned to Columbus last year with the Kraken, is also coming back to where he's played most of his career to this point, having played the 1 year in Florida before coming to the Kraken. But Wennberg also returning, gets what ends up being, spoiler alert, the game-winning goal here on the power play as he just whips around and once again slides one through the 5-hole of Merzlikins. But of course, because it's a Seattle sports team, and it just seems like all Seattle sports teams have some sort of deal with healthcare. I mean, actually, now that I think about it, the Kraken do have commercials with Premier Blue Cross. But anyway, the Kraken once again decide to kind of just go into defense first mode with the 1-goal lead the rest of this third period, testing the heart health of Kraken fans everywhere against a team that they should be beating easily. They just have that 1-goal lead. And oh boy, did Columbus try to tie this game, as somewhere in the middle of this end of the third period, Columbus gets one, again, grade A+ scoring opportunity as there's chaos in front of the Kraken net. Grubauer has to make a couple of saves, and then the puck ends up to the side of the net where the only player there is Johnny Gaudreau, one of the best players on that Columbus lineup. He has the puck with just empty net to shoot at, as Grubauer is already down and out, having made a couple of saves at the other side of the net. But before Gaudreau can get cleanly to the puck, eventually getting off the shot, Grubauer dives back with both hands, and I think it was somewhat helped, if we're being honest, by Gaudreau not quite getting everything on this shot that he would have liked to get on it. But the puck slides into Grubauer, who makes the spectacular diving two-handed save. I mean, it wasn't a 2-pad stack, it was a, I guess, glove and blocker stack, but 2-arm stack either way, as he dives back to make a second in 2 games, game-saving, highlight reel save, this time on Johnny Gaudreau. And I mean, ask Gaudreau what he thought of this. His reaction pretty much said everything that needed to be said. And thankfully, this would be the hardest save that Grubauer would have to make the rest of the way, as Columbus continued to try to press to tie the game until the end of this third period, which isn't to say that the Kraken weren't pressing the offensive end over the course of this third period. In fact, I do think they probably had more shots on goal, I think, the rest of the way than Columbus did, but they just weren't holding the offensive end and getting that consistent offensive zone pressure that we saw them get whenever the game was tied, or certainly in that small window when Columbus had a lead. They just kind of were, I mean, taking the offense that was given to them, but definitely playing defensive-minded hockey, which didn't allow them to extend that lead, at least until eventually the net does go empty in the final couple of minutes. And to make the score 4-2, who else finds the empty net? But of course, Brandon Tanev, as he ends up on a breakaway. Shot from up by the blue line by the Blue Jackets in the Kraken end, deflects off the skate of Schwartz. Tanev gets to it first, ends up on a breakaway, looks around behind him to see if there's any teammates that he can set up for a goal, because, you know, again, the good old hockey guy thing to do, if you have a shot at the empty net, you gotta see if there's a teammate first that you can give the goal to. But Tanev, seeing no one other than himself, just skates it into the net, getting his 12th of the season, which at this point it feels like half of those have to be empty netters. And even with that being said, empty netters are obviously the easiest goals that most players are ever going to get. But you have to earn from the coaching staff and through playing well defensively the right to be out on the ice consistently in those 6-on-5 situations, and then also be good enough defensively to actually end up with the puck on your stick. So it's not necessarily, sure, Tanev doesn't have to put up impressive shots in order to score on these empty netters, but he does have to play very sound defensively to have those opportunities. So he still earns them, even if he earns them in a different way. And of course, with that empty netter going in, it is at this point, with the 2-goal lead and 40 seconds left, the Kraken have probably their best press since taking the lead earlier on in the third period in the offensive end in those final 40 seconds, as the fourth line has one more very good scoring chance they're able to create in the final seconds. But the score does end 4-2, and the Kraken thankfully escape Columbus and the first 3 games of this road trip with 6 points and 3 wins that, boy, did they make them interesting, but they got the job done. And in the end, that really is the biggest takeaway from this game and really these 3 games, is that the Kraken were able to do what we expected of them and get, again, at least 5 points is what we wanted out of these first 3 games of the road trip, and they managed to get all 6. Certainly wanting them to win the 2 very winnable games in Detroit and this one in Columbus. They are able to do that. And as far as other takeaways from this game, The best positive takeaway, I think, from this game is that the Kraken, like we talked about in that game against Detroit, were finally able to play that suffocating defense in their defensive end at a consistent rate, really, in this game, not allowing a lot in and around the net or even out in front of it in the slot during this game. Sure, the second goal that ends up tying the game in the third period for Columbus does come from the slot, but even at that, the origin of that shot was up at the blue line from the outside, and then the secondary shot that comes from the slot is really just off of a weird bounce, as there's, after that deflection is made, there's just kind of a scramble as everyone tries to find the puck, and unfortunately it went right to a Columbus player who could get that clean shot off before the Kraken defense and Grubauer were able to respond. So I don't really count that one necessarily as a defensive or even goaltending issue. It's just a fortunate bounce for the Blue Jackets, who very nearly had an unfortunate bounce actually during the third period, as they almost had one go in as an own goal. It was a puck that came out, I think defensively, hit by a defenseman out from behind their net that went off of Merzlikins between his legs and slid just in front of the goal, but they're able to keep it out as they, again, nearly put it in themselves. Either way, they get the lucky bounce here to tie up the game, and that's really all I think that was. The Kraken played well in their defensive end, which is what we'd like to see them do and will continue to need to do, especially facing a very good Colorado Avalanche team here coming up. Now, the other part of their game that we mentioned liking to see them try to clean up here in this one from that Detroit game was their issue of playing sloppy enough to get sent to the penalty box over and over again, which they definitely did not clean up until, I guess, halfway through the second period in this game. They did play the back half of this game, I guess, pretty clean, but it would be nice to see them stay out of the penalty box, certainly as many times as they did in these last two games, and especially in this next one against Colorado, as, I mean, we talked about how testing even a team like Columbus, they have a couple of high-end players that if you test them that many times on a power play, eventually they're going to make you pay. Colorado has enough players to very much make you pay if you send them to even one or two power plays. So let's hope the Kraken that the Kraken have gone to the box enough for a few games here in the last couple and just stay out of it entirely in this next one. As for the Kraken 3 stars in this game, the first star, once again, it's going to be Jared McCann. He had a fantastic game, even outside of the goal and assist that he gets, obviously with that goal being his 30th of the season and him being, again, the first Kraken 30 goal scorer in team history. He just continues to have the hot hand when it comes to goal scoring, but just playing well outside of that. Really, that Beniers line of him and Eberle has been playing very, very well. And although for most of the season that has been really driven by Beniers, these last couple of games, it's just been McCann and Eberle having incredible chemistry between the two of them, which has also extended to the power play that they both play on the same unit of, or at least sometimes they play on the same unit. Actually, in this game, I think they were playing on different units, which is part of why Eberle doesn't assist on the McCann goal, but McCann does assist on the Eberle goal, so they still connected for at least one goal this game. Second star, that's going to be Alex Wennberg. Honestly, outside of his goal, which, I mean, it was nice to see Wennberg actually take a shot on net and score on the power play. Finally, with that, going back to being the net front guy for the Kraken on the power play, which we talked about him giving up that easy goal opportunity earlier this season, and then being frustrated about why you're putting a guy that refuses to shoot the puck right in front of the net on the power play. Well, he was in front of the net, got the puck, and made a shot this time and scored on it. So there you go. Wennberg shooting on the power play and scoring from in front of the net. But even outside of that, he was honestly, even with McCann, but maybe outside of McCann, the best Kraken player out on the ice in this game. Probably their best defensive player. He was just very active in the Kraken defensive end and neutral zone. A number of steals. In fact, I think he's leading the league or among the tops in the league as far as 5-on-5 takeaways, or maybe just takeaways in general. So Wennberg does, and also probably the best Kraken player, maybe outside of Geekie, but one of their best players in the faceoff circle, which continues to be a big issue for the Kraken. So Wennberg doing a lot of the small things right for the Kraken, and I think really earning the money that is on his contract this season, doing a lot of those small things. Again, some of the more noticeable things, like not shooting on breakaways or odd man rushes when he has clear shots, are a lot more noticeable and a lot more frustrating. But Wennberg, for me at least, has had a great season for the Kraken and continues to do a lot of these smaller, harder to notice things very well. And then the third star for me, again, is a little bit harder to narrow it down to one guy. I almost gave it to either one of the duo defensively of Oleksiak and Borgen, as they continue to play pretty well here over the last couple of weeks. They did have a month or two there of being the biggest liability on the Kraken roster, but over these last couple of weeks, they've kind of taken over the mantle of the best defensive pairing the Kraken has going right now, especially with Larson and Dunn, although they've still been fantastic over the course of the whole season, have had some defensive issues here in the last little stretch, but fortunately, some of that has been made up for with how well this Oleksiak and Borgen pairing has been playing. In the end, though, I did end up going with Jaden Schwartz, as he had a number of grade A scoring chances in this game. He certainly very easily could have had 1 or 2 goals, and honestly probably could have had a hat trick if he had any kind of shooting luck this game, but doesn't end up getting one to go. After having a goal in the last game, nearly gets a couple more in this one, and certainly seems like he's back to being his consistent offensive production self after recovering from that injury. But as always, let me know what you guys think down in the comment section below. If you did join for the stream, thank you once again very much for joining for that stream. If you didn't have the chance, I know it was started during the workday and all that for a lot of people, especially on the West Coast here, but we'll have more streams throughout the course of the season and try and get some maybe on a weekend or at least evening games, maybe some West Coast road trip games that they have so that it isn't starting during a workday. Either way, let me know what you think, who your 3 stars of this game would be, and yeah, if anybody is feeling like they could really use this day off and a little bit of rest for the heart. Anyway, if you haven't made it to this point, thank you very much for watching. If you did like or enjoy this video, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down below that help support the channel. And until next time, where hopefully Bjorkstrand and maybe even Burakovsky are back for the Kraken against my old favorite team in the Colorado Avalanche. Stay safe out there, be good to each other, God bless, and go Kraken!